Hello everyone, welcome to GS Core. Today in this session we'll be discussing about GS mains answer writing, and the topic of discussion is disaster management. And under disaster management we will be discussing about a theme, and the theme is India's vulnerability to different disasters, right? So before we discuss theme, disaster management, you must be aware it is mentioned in GS paper 3. And if you see the syllabus, they have mentioned disasters and disaster management, right? The syllabus mentions about disasters and disaster management, right? So this does not provide us good idea about what exactly we are supposed to study under disaster management. And that's why one must go through previous year questions. Previous year questions. And if you go through previous year questions, you'll find that under the disaster management heading of general studies paper 3, they have asked questions on different types of disasters. What are the mitigation steps that have been taken by government authorities for the mitigation of disasters, right? So, and also the disaster management approaches. The questions have been asked on disaster management approaches as well, right? So three types of questions. Firstly, disasters and mitigation steps. Mitigation steps, right? Where primarily focus is on NDMA guidelines. NDMA guidelines given by National Disaster Management Authority, right? So that is the prime focus. Secondly, they have asked questions on disaster management approaches, reactive approach, proactive approach. So those approaches they have asked question on disaster management approaches. And the questions are also there on the initiatives that have been taken. Initiatives that have been taken for disaster management. Initiatives taken for disaster management at both international as well as national level, right? So that is the focus of that is the focus of previous year questions. So on the basis of previous year questions, we will be discussing about the vulnerabilities of different disasters, right? So the theme that we will be discussing under this session is India's vulnerability to different disasters. India's vulnerability to different disasters. So we know that given the vast geographical extent of India, India is vulnerable to different types of disasters, right? So more often than not, these disasters are climatic disasters. They are related to climate. Fine. So given the vast geographical extent, we witness various kinds of climatic disasters. Why? Because given the geographical extent, the climate of regions is different. Climate of different regions is different. Fine. Similarly, the population of India uh, is also very high, and as a result of that, people are more vulnerable to those disasters, right? Along with that, population and poverty makes India vulnerable to different disasters, right? So what kind of disasters? So these are the factors which make India vulnerable, and added to that we have the factor of climate change as well, right? Climate change, right? So because of these factors, the disasters occur, and the intensity of all these factors is getting aggravated by human mismanagement. Human mismanagement, right? So primarily the disasters that we witness these days have the influence of human beings, right? So what kind of disasters to which India is vulnerable to. So the disasters are like earthquakes. Earthquakes. You must be aware of four different zones which are given by Bureau of BSI. Sorry, Bureau of Indian Standard, BIS, Bureau of Indian Standard has given four zones where they have classified different regions with respect to their vulnerability to earthquakes, right? So earthquake is the prime disaster that we have in India, and most of the regions which are vulnerable to earthquakes, they lie on the plate boundaries, fine. So that is first. Then we have then second disaster is floods. Floods. Different regions of India are vulnerable to floods. Why? Because approximately 70% of rainfall we receive during the monsoonal season, and the intensity has increased. That means the dry spell, their time period has increased, and also the time period of wet spell has also increased. And as a result of that, we are getting huge amount of rainfall in a short span of time. So due to that, India has become more vulnerable to floods. Added to that, there is a new phenomenon these days, and that is what is called as urban floods. Urban floods are primarily the result of concretization that we have carried out. Encroachment in the wetlands has also led to urban floods, right? So floods is the second disaster. Then we also have the disasters in the form of droughts. Droughts, right? Because there are various parts of India which receive rainfall less than 50 millimeters, 50 centimeters. And as the rainfall is less than 50 centimeters, they are more vulnerable to the disaster called as droughts, right? And added to that, there is a type of drought called as hydrological drought. Hydrological drought. And this hydrological drought is more often than not is the result of human interference. As our dependency on groundwater has increased, we are witnessing hydrological drought, right? Primarily Deccan interiors. It is that region where we are taking more water intensive crop in the form of sugarcane. And because of that, that region is vulnerable to hydrological drought. Why? As sugarcane is cultivated there, the dependency of farmers on groundwater has increased a lot, and that makes this region vulnerable to hydrological drought, where not only surface water resources are unavailable, even groundwater becomes unavailable. That kind of drought is called as hydrological drought. So that is the third important disaster which affects India. Then apart from droughts, we also have disasters like cloudbursts, cloudbursts, right? And cloudburst can directly be attributed to climate change. It can directly be attributed to climate change, and primarily the mountainous region of India is vulnerable to cloudburst, right? And UPSC has asked question on cloudburst already. In 22's mains examination, there was a question on cloudburst, fine. Then there are disasters like landslides, fine. And landslide regions are primarily the Himalayan region, Western Ghats, and even the Eastern Ghats and Central Indian locations are becoming vulnerable to landslides. Along with that, even Northeastern region. Earlier, Northeastern region was not too vulnerable to landslides, but because of the developmental activities that we are carrying out, the Northeastern region is also becoming vulnerable to landslides. Fine. So these are the disasters. Then we also have disasters like hailstorm, which is affecting agriculture of India. Then the disasters are like heat waves and cold waves. Heat waves and cold waves, right? Where there is intense temperature increase is seen in certain regions of India, and during winters, the temperatures fall below the normal level, right? So the regions are witnessing, different regions are witnessing heat and cold wave conditions. One more important disaster is cyclones. Cyclones. And again, cyclones can also be attributed to the changes in climatic conditions. It can directly attributed to changes in climatic conditions. And we know that, see, today the climate change that we are talking about is not natural climate change, it is anthropogenic climate change. It is anthropogenic climate change. Fine. So cyclones, where the eastern part of India, eastern coast of India is more vulnerable. Along with that, the vulnerability of western coast has also increased in the recent times. Fine. So these are important disasters that we should be aware of. Along with that, forest fire is also an important disaster where question may be asked by UPSC. Forest fires, right? Even urban fires, the frequency of urban fires has increased these days, and that is primarily the result of unplanned urbanization, where there is increased population density in certain regions, and due to the increased population density in that region, it is difficult for the forest department vehicles to enter in those smaller lanes in those regions, and that increases the vulnerability of those people to urban fires. Fine. So these different kind of disasters we should be aware of, and that is about the first theme, where focus is on India's vulnerability to different disasters. So these disasters and many more disasters are there to which India is vulnerable to, but prime focus should be on these disasters, because if you go through previous year questions, you will find that questions have been asked on this. For example, questions have been asked on earthquakes, floods, droughts, then landslides. Two questions have been asked on landslide. First was asked in 2013, and it was again asked in 2021's mains examination. Right? Even the cloudburst, as we discussed, there was a question on 22's mains examination. Right? So these are certain important disasters to which India is vulnerable to. Fine. So these disasters, and what are the guidelines given by NDMA for handling these disasters, that is also an important aspect, right? So for these disasters, NDMA guidelines, for mitigation, right? So that is also an important aspect. Fine. So that is about this theme. Thank you.